Jon Morosi, is it going to happen or not? Because I got to be honest with you, I am getting fed up with the fact that Major League Baseball just can't get this worked out.
Well, good morning, Clay. I would say, my friend, we must have patience still for the next week or 10 days. I remain optimistic that we're going to have baseball. One of the most important reasons why is that the proposal yesterday from MLB to the union did not involve that 50-50 revenue split that the union reportedly did not want to have. And so now it's just a matter of negotiating on the financial aspects of it. Yes, there is still a reduction in salary. That was a really big part of the agreement yesterday. But I think in general, as long as there's a way to negotiate around those particulars, we could potentially see, and I still think we will see, baseball in 2020.
All right, here's a question that I have for you. If you gave the players the option to either consider this year to be one of their contracted years or not. Let me explain what I mean by this. Let's say you are Mike Trout and you're making $35 million plus or whatever it is, and he's taking a huge pay cut to play this year. What if you allowed him to elect to add one more year to his contract, and effectively this year doesn't really count? But if you're a young guy and you are out there and you're making $1 million a year, but you want to work towards your payday one year in the future, what if you allowed the young guy to be able to count it? In other words, what if you gave players the option? Because then it kind of turns it into, okay, this is a totally unnatural, so it's important to come back. It seems like that might be something that is really appealing to players because it gives them the option to make the best financial decision for themselves without having to consider this to be a huge precedent that's being set for this year.
That's a very credible idea, Clay. The general sense being that players at varying ends of the spectrum could be or perhaps should be handled differently.
Yes.
And we're already seeing that. Reportedly, Jesse Rogers of ESPN reporting some of the details of the scale in terms of what the salary reductions would be. The players on the lower end actually have a higher percentage of what their salary would have been. They are still going to get under the current proposal, whereas the more dramatic reductions on a percentage basis go to the highest earners at all. So interestingly, Clay, there's a pretty large percentage of players, maybe even a majority of players, who are within range of what the prorated salary was going to be on the lower end, and certainly for just based on the numbers of the union, those players, half the league or so, probably more than that, stand to earn about what they would have on a purely prorated basis, period. So I think it's, to your point, Clay, there is probably a way to handle different players in a unique way based on where they're at in their career and on the salary scale. And I do think that the need to earn that money for the players on the lower end who have not made their largest fortunes, of course, to this point in time, could be one of the really key factors in arriving finally at an agreement.
Here are a couple of data points that I think are important for fans out there listening to us. If you make, I think the Major League Baseball minimum is around $563,501, based on reading this. If you make that league minimum up to $1 million, you would make, under this Major League Baseball proposal, 72.5% of your yearly salary. If you make up to $5 million, you make 50% of your salary. So all players who make $5 million a year or less would make, at worst, half of their salary. Considering they're playing half of the season, I think most people out there listening would say, that kind of sounds pretty fair to me. Again, you can negotiate around the edges, and certainly higher paid players may have more be more upset over what's happening here. But for $5 million or less, which is the substantial majority of Major League Baseball players, to be making at least half their salaries, that doesn't sound like a non-starter to me. That sounds like a fairly good offer.
Well, Clay, I think just the one point of fact on that, based on what the details ESPN have reported, that is the percentage of the prorated amount that they would still make. So, in other words, for the 563 player, the prorated amount would be 285. Again, according to Jesse Rogers' numbers, so 285 would be half, and that under this proposal they would get 262. So they'd go from 285 to 262. The point being that, to your point, I think in general, Clay, that you're making is those players would be getting a lot closer to what their baseline expected salary would be than on a percentage basis what the highest earners would get. And that makes good logical sense. It really does. And that, I think those numbers overall, my hope is that they're a reasonable starting point, and then you can negotiate from there. I think that's while it's certainly not ideal that in many ways it's all playing out in public in terms of the negotiations, this is still a matter of bargaining, and I think it's important to be patient and to not criticize the union or MLB too much just for having a negotiation at all, because that's a natural part of sports. I think that we have to wait and see what the agreement is. I believe there's going to be an agreement in the next week to 10 days, and frankly, Clay, I think it's important to point out too, the track record for baseball to reach an agreement is actually quite strong. Of our four major sports, they are the sport that's gone the longest since a work stoppage. So it has worked out. It just requires, I think, now a little bit more negotiating than it has for the NBA and the NHL right now.
So I think many people are where I am, where initially this is a health-related concern. Now it's a money-related concern. If they can't work it out, how crippling is this to baseball if they just didn't play this year?
Well, it would obviously be problematic for the sport long term. There's no question about it, especially when you compare it to the sports that are going to play, it appears, in the case of the NHL and the NBA. I'll restate that I believe baseball will play. I think there's going to be an agreement. I realize that it seems far away right now, but I think both sides, to your point, Clay, realize that. They realize how important it is for the long-term viability of the sport to get the game back on the field this year once they can do so safely, and I believe that they will realize that and make it happen. I think, Clay, it's interesting that while there is still this public contentiousness on some levels with the negotiations, you had this week Tropicana Field in St. Petersburg, Florida, opening up for players to work out in small groups, and they were there. The players were there 2 days ago. There's photos of it on the Rays Twitter account. So I take a step back and say, yes, they're negotiating, but if there was really pessimism about playing this year, do I really think that there would have been players at the Major League Baseball home facility of a team working out 2 days ago in their gear for the season? It seems to me, Clay, that is a really good data point overall, that they're talking and that there's hopefully going to be an agreement. But I think that, to your point, it really is incumbent on the leagues to make the right decisions with the right amount of care and thought as it relates to public health. But when it comes to getting the game back in front of their fans and taking care of everybody that's involved in the sport, all things must be done properly. But I think the key thing is showing that proper sensitivity to the public, but also getting your product back in front of the fans is of paramount importance for baseball right now.
What's your time frame here? I know we talk about this a lot, but is June 1 the drop-dead date? Is June 10? Like, when do they need to have this ironed away in order to get back?
I would say around June 1, early days of June. So that means by early to middle part of next week, and that's a general range. I don't think that if you can't reach an agreement by June 1, then June 2 all of a sudden is too late. I think that there is still some time. And again, the fact that the first proposal from MLB to the union was in the same general economic framework of the way the sport has operated. In other words, there was no strict revenue sharing as part of it. Then you're just going over numbers as opposed to philosophy. And that to me is where I realize that these are big numbers that are hard to comprehend, but when you are at least discussing the numbers, it's at least good that you're in the same rhetorical headspace as opposed to arguing about how you're going to actually frame things. So I'm optimistic that they'll find a way. And yes, Clay, I believe that by the early middle part of next week is going to be the really crucial time to make sure that they have a deal ready to roll.
Let's look at the data as the data is coming in. Things are getting better, right? We don't know whether that's going to continue projection-wise, but I believe there will be fans in some form or fashion in football stadiums come September. right, for college and pro on some level. Some people can disagree. I think if you look at this Major League Baseball season, there's a possibility, if things continue to move in the direction they're moving in right now, that there could be fans in the stadium before Major League Baseball is done. How would that factor in potentially to the revenue here? Is it flexible in that sense? In other words, let's say that things get a lot better than baseball expects. They play throughout the entirety of the postseason. How does that get factored into what players get paid?
Yeah, it's a fair question, Clay. I think right now that, especially given the origin of the agreement to play and the conditions by which this process and the pay structure is being reopened by MLB, because it is not currently safe across the country in every place to have fans in the stands. Because of that reality, there is then now this separate negotiation on salary, and I don't foresee baseball changing that approach of no fans, because one of the most significant concerns right now, Clay, is that you're able to play the playoffs. And so MLB is not going to want to risk having a large mass gathering that could potentially become a super spreading event, like we saw, for example, in Italy with the soccer game that was played right before the outbreak in Bergamo in the north of Italy. Baseball does not want that to happen, first and foremost because of the public health reality, but also, second of all, because it would jeopardize the playoffs. And the most important thing from baseball's perspective is to have the playoffs played and get them on television. And if that obviously aside from the larger concerns about life and well-being, but that from a strictly operational perspective, that's the key concern, because that's where most of the revenues come in. And I believe, Clay, that the agreement will reflect the reality that if they're able to play the playoffs, perhaps there could be a larger amount of sharing of the revenues, as Joel Sherman's reported there, with the union from the playoffs if and when they are played.
Outstanding stuff as always, Jon Morosi. Hopefully next week we'll be able to announce the return of baseball. I'm hoping for it when we talk to you.
Sounds great, Clay. Thanks so much for all the time, my friend, as always.
Jon Morosi with us right now. Good JONMOROSI. You can follow him right there.